Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the year ahead in staffing from AI to Z. We'll let everybody get into your respective seats here in the platform, and we'll get things started here in about 30 seconds. But excited to have everyone. While you're getting seated, just a little bit of housekeeping to take everybody through. We are recording this session, so you will have our smiling faces and hopefully some of the insight that we can bring available to you. We do have some slides. It would not be a Noah and Eric webinar without some charts to dive through. So we'll have those as well. You'll get the slides, you'll get the recording. If you have questions, please do put them into either the chat or the Q&A panel, and we'll be going through each of that as well. So to kind of start with, let's get the chat kind of warmed up a little bit here. And if anybody could just put in, what are you most excited about in the new year? Could be personal, could be professional, but what are you most excited about in the year ahead? And while we're doing that, I'm going to introduce myself and welcome my panelists here and get this thing started. So for those that don't know me, I'm Eric Gregg. I'm the founder at ClearlyRated, and we are a provider of client experience, talent experience, and internal employee experience programs for staffing firms. We've been doing it for now close to 20 years. You may know us from the Best of Staffing programs, Best Staffing Firms for Women. We also do a lot of research in the space that we make available. In fact, we've got some other webinars coming up where we're going to deep dive into some of those, but we'll sneak peek a little bit of that information there as well. Today, though, I'm most excited to introduce our panel. And so I want to start by introducing Danny Ashraf, who he and I have known each other for a very, very long time in this industry. And he's the head of the staffing recruiting business on the sales side of it, one of the most well-known industry technology leaders in our space. There's really few people in the industry with a better pulse on what is actually working and what staffing firms are actually doing that is happening right now. So he's kind of my go-to when we think about that. So I'll talk about this, and Danny, we'll get into your information here, but I just want to start things off by asking you a little bit of a different version of what I asked in the chat, which is, what do you think the industry should be most excited about in 2025?
Most excited about in 2025, more than the Monster and CareerBuilder merger, I would say we've seen early signs of increased activity on the hiring front so far in the first couple of weeks of the year. And we'll dig into more of the boring data later in this webinar, but I'm very bullish on that.
Noah, he used boring and data in the same sentence. I don't even know. It's not even really registering for me because the next person I want to introduce is Noah Yosif, my fellow data geek, the chief economist, head of research at the American Staffing Association. Noah and I work very closely on a number of projects for ASA. He's regularly featured with financial media such as Bloomberg, Barron's, Wall Street Journal, CNBC, Fox Business. The list goes on his insights on what's happening in the employment sector. There's been nobody that has really been more responsible for opening my eyes to a whole bunch of really interesting data sets for our industry than Noah. And so welcome, Noah. I really appreciate you joining us. Same question for you. What do you think that the industry should be most excited for in 2025?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm actually going to take an answer from the chat here and say summer. Although, since I'm not a meteorologist, I would say what runs a close second for me is a potential recovery within staffing employment. And unfortunately, we will have to sift through some boring data and statistics, but we will take a look at the recovery that we are expecting to see within the industry in 2025.
Awesome. Well, we will make sure to make those statistics as jump off the screen, won't we, Noah?
Yes.
Okay, so God and Zoom willing, I'm going to put up a quick little poll here, and we'll put that onto the screen. Hopefully you're seeing the poll here, and take a second to answer this. What is going to have the biggest impact on your firm's growth in 2025? So go ahead and take just a couple minutes to answer that, and then we'll share back the answers. It's actually really good insight for us, and it gives us an opportunity to kind of have a good sense as to where people believe things are going here as well. So we have a couple polls throughout this that we'll be utilizing here as well. So we'll close out the poll here in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we'll just share the results there. But 69% said effectively landing new accounts, and 19% growing our existing accounts to earn a higher share of wallet. Improving marketing and online reputation was about 8%, and then improving the retention of the temporary employees on assignment was 4%. So, these are obviously, this is hard because hopefully this was a difficult decision for some people as they were going through this. I'm personally going to make it my mission to try to move some of you from the effectively landing new accounts into the growing existing accounts and the share there as well. But I also want to see what the revenue growth expectations are for the year. So one more poll here as we get things started. Go ahead and answer this poll as well. What are you projecting for year-over-year revenue growth for your firm in 2025? And recognizing that a lot of this depends on the sector that you're in as well. Healthcare is certainly still, battling to right, what has changed in the last couple of years there. But hopefully, some of you expecting to get back to a growth standpoint there as well. Good answers on that. We already have almost 100 of the 140 in the room here. So I'm going to end the poll here in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I'll share those results as well. So pretty bullish, guys. I'll just start with Danny. Your thoughts on this? We see all but about 9% expecting to grow at least a little bit. The biggest tranche of that being in the 5 to 10% growth area. What's your reaction to that? You talk to a lot of leaders in the space. Does that kind of jive with what you've been hearing?
Yeah, I love that. Almost or less than 10% said flat or less than that. So I think if you asked the room the same question 6 months ago, that the answers would have been lopsided the other way. So I'm really excited that the tides are turning, or at least our clients are feeling the same.
Noah, what's your take? You see a lot of this. You've done some projections for this next year, which we'll get into at a later point. But does this feel, like just hopeful optimism, or is there some reason to feel like these could be right?
Well, it certainly seems that the industry is really embracing the spirit of the new year, and they're not wrong. When you look at the data, a lot of the economic trends within the labor market and economy at large are showing a recovery within key facets that are of particular importance to the staffing industry, which we will get into a bit later. So I think that definitely, as we're starting to see a broader recovery within the labor market and the economy at large, that's definitely starting to filter down to our industry, and we're starting to feel the optimism as well.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to now go through a few things. I've got one more that I'm going to hit here in just a few minutes, but let's go ahead and jump through some of this data. And I want to start, Noah, with you. We kind of pulled through our greatest hits on a few of these things. So we're going to talk about bridging 2024 to 2025. What do we expect? And you pulled together a few slides I thought were really interesting. So talk us through what we're seeing on these slides, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. So, in that spirit, let us take a step back, actually not to last year, but just before the Great Resignation. We saw that staffing employment had done particularly well in the immediate preceding the Great Resignation, and that was in large part due to the fact that the economy was beginning to reopen after the pandemic, and there was a lot more momentum within the labor market. But as we went through the Great Resignation, so this would be about 2022, what we started to see was that there was a lot of overhiring that was done, and that companies in particular, they were starting to tighten up their pocketbooks a little bit. And so the orders were in late 2022 and into 2023, they were starting to decline. They did not reach the same sort of levels that our industry saw in 2021 and 2022. And so that's when in 2023, we really saw a negative amount of growth within our industry. And that 2023 was really when our industry kind of hit that trough in which we didn't necessarily see any growth, but we also didn't see further declines.
Yeah.
And so in 2024, last year, what we happened to see was that our industry did start to rebound a little bit. While we did have some off months, we also did have some positive months, particularly within the last 3 months of the year. We did see our industry post a notable recovery in terms of total staffing employment. And so therefore, what we at ASA believe is that this trend is going to continue on the basis of a better labor market as well as a better economy at large. Speaking of which, the two trends that we're particularly interested in on the next slide in the labor market are labor leverage and total compensation. Now, I remember that in the poll that we did, most of you were looking for ways to either add new accounts or grow your existing accounts. And one of the biggest hindrances that are standing in the way of opening new accounts or expanding those accounts is total compensation costs. What we see is that total compensation costs, that dark red line, is still way above pre-pandemic levels. And so what that means is that as companies still face elevated costs to bring on new workers, they're going to be less likely to bring on additional headcount. Now, quite similarly, because employers are not that willing to bring on new headcount as those compensation costs are high, employees are reading the tea leaves and they're still not as confident about seeing new opportunities on the labor market. And so that's why we see labor leverage, or the balance of influence within the employee and employer relationship, that is still far down below pre-pandemic levels. In other words, employees don't have a lot of leverage against their employers. They don't have a lot of influence because they can't necessarily find a new opportunity on the market just yet. And because of that, they're going to be more willing to stick with their current position rather than explore those new opportunities. However, as you will see on the next slide, what we do know is that much of 2025 is going to depend on whether compensation costs come down and whether labor leverage increases. That's going to be the key to not only getting new accounts, but also growing your existing accounts. And so there are a couple of trends that we're looking at, some that we know and some that we don't know, that are going to influence lower compensation costs and higher leverage. The knowns that we know is that economic growth is going to be relatively stable in 2025. It's not going to be as high as we saw during the pandemic or post-pandemic, but it's going to be stable. We also know that in the long term, inflation is going to come down. While the report that we got out yesterday didn't necessarily show much positive momentum in disinflation, it also didn't show that inflation was rising too much. And so therefore, we believe that in the long run, inflation is going to decline. Quite similarly, we know that unemployment is staying about flat, just above 4%. And we also know that in the long term, despite some of the missteps that the Fed is seeing with inflation, its goal is still to reduce interest rates. So what we know is that these conditions are not only going to bring down compensation costs that allow employers to add new headcount, but it's also going to provide more confidence to employees in terms of getting back out there on the labor market. Some of the things that we don't necessarily know just yet about how 25 is going to shape are going to primarily be in terms of economic policy, what I call TRIPS for short. That's taxes, tariffs, regulation, and immigration policy. Now, I'm going to get into these a little bit later, but every one of these policies is going to have a different effect on both compensation costs as well as labor leverage, and that is going to be a key determinant in seeing whether we're able to add accounts or add new ones. Eric?
Yeah, super interesting. And, Danny, one of the things I like to have conversations with you about is like, okay, let's make sense of this for the practitioners. Like what are kind of your takeaways on this? What do you think this actually means for, staffing firm executives on the call today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think these are tailwinds now instead of headwinds, but it's super, super important to not take our foot off the gas. In 2022, our sales teams were in a world of order taking and inbound activity, and we had to retool in 2024. So a lot of companies invested in business development teams, business development tools, and went back to old-fashioned selling, which is important. So it's paramount that in 2025 you don't just think that the economy is going to get better and that business is going to become an inbound situation again. So my advice is keep your foot on the gas, double down on the sales and recruiting efforts or sales efforts in the first few months of the year.
Yeah, I think a lot of staffing firms really kind of went back to the gym a little bit and leaned up, got stronger during this time, as sort of a force of requirements. And I do think that what we're going to see now is a lot of firms that have done a lot of hard work over the last couple of years, and they're going to start to see some of that paying off in 2025 and beyond. So my turn now. I get to geek out a little bit. This is one of my favorite sets of data to really follow. This is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, their job openings and labor turnover survey, what they call the JOLTS survey. And so if you look at layoffs and discharges, you can see average layoffs really are still below that pre-pandemic level. And when we look at pre-pandemic, really we shorten that time frame to the 2 years leading up to the drop because of the pandemic. Because what we actually found was that there were a lot of things that were happening that were really accelerated by the pandemic, but that were already really starting to happen. And one of those was quits. Quits were already starting to rise as we went into the pandemic. Then it kind of hit pause, and you heard talk about the Great Resignation. It really was true, right? During that 2022 time period, every month in 2022, more people quit than in any month in the prior 20 years. And so people were quitting at this really, really rapid rate. And you look through November, which is their latest data, you can see that the quits now are down well below that peak, also well below the pre-pandemic level. But layoffs are still actually, not only down from the pandemic peak as you would expect, but they're actually still down from that pre-pandemic level as well. And this really speaks to what Noah was talking about, which is that there's just not as much movement in the space right now from a variety of levels. People aren't being laid off at historically high levels, but they're also not quitting now at a level that they once were. And so that leaves us with a little bit of stagnation in the industry. When we look at hires, what we see is that the hires are actually still down from pre-pandemic. The job openings are actually up, and we'll get some real-time look into that with Danny here in just a few minutes. But it's not that we don't have job openings, right? It's just that the pace of hiring has really slowed down, and that's really impacted us as well. And so when we look at this, one of the things and why I really wanted to make sure that we had Noah on here is, when we look at the estimations of the jobs that have been added versus the actual jobs that have been added, what we've seen is this massive miss by most of the economists in this space. And so, they have estimated lower than what the actual new jobs were 69% of the time over the last 3 years. And median error on that was actually huge. It was 43%. And so what that means is that, we're really kind of trying to take this new data, and it's just not acting in the same way that it used to. And we're seeing that in the staffing industry as well, right? This is just looking at the blue line here is overall employment, and staffing is that green line. And in general, if you would have talked to Noah and I ahead of this, and you would have said, hey, we got a strong economy, we got strong overall growth in employment, what do you think's happening with temporary employment? We would have said, okay, temporary employment's probably doing pretty well. Because historically, we have been pretty highly correlated with overall employment. We maybe lead it into a recession and we lead it out of a recession, but it's been pretty highly correlated. Well, starting in October 2022, that just kind of broke down, and we've seen declines in temporary employment even as we've had gains in overall employment. And in fact, the percentage of overall employment that is temporary employees right now, according to BLS, is hit a low point that was the lowest we've seen since 2014. And so when we look at this, what's interesting about these last 2 years and now 3 months as a part of this is it's just been a really longer slog at the bottom than usual. So I just wanted to show you what 2008 looked like. We had this big drop, really pretty radical drop in 2008. It was 9 months to the bottom, and then we started to get better, but it was 18 months and we started growing and year-over-year growth. You look at the pandemic and 3 months to the bottom, right? So it was a really quick free fall. And then we started to grow again in 14 months. Well, we're now in month 27. And as Noah kind of pointed out, we've got some real positive, momentum maybe showing up in the last 3 months there as a part of that. But we're still, significantly below on the year-over-year gains. And so we have not actually started to get into this point where this year we're employing more people than last year. And that's the longest that the industry has ever been kind of below zero on year-over-year gain in employment. And so, the question, Noah, I think I have is like, why? What's going on? What are we seeing here? And what can staffing firms do about it? And I think you've got a great slide that kind of speaks to this, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. Well, I think you also sort of answered your own question, and that is that, we're in recovery mode, but a recovery is not going to be at an immediate snap of the finger. It's going to be slow. And so therefore, staffing companies that are really able to excel right now are going to be the ones that still treat the current operating environment as business as usual, as if there's no recovery going on. Now, staffing companies really can't do much about the macroeconomic environment. Sure, business is our people, or our people is business. However, we really can't add an additional couple 100,000 jobs into the labor market. Only our clients can. However, we can control our revenue. And so looking at industry revenues over the past 19, 20 years, what we see is that temporary staffing services, as well as temp to perm placements, have slowly contributed less of a share of total industry revenue. So what's going on is that all other operating revenue is starting to comprise a larger share of total industry revenue. In other words, that means that staffing companies are expanding. They're trying out different business segments, things like consulting, executive coaching, project management. They're not simply going about the regular business that they did 20 or 30 years ago. They're trying to look at where the labor market has a need, and that need is not always going to be short-term temporary work. And so staffing companies are looking to expand their portfolio of services, and that's where the opportunity lies for companies in terms of being able to sustain, if not grow revenues, despite less than favorable employment and labor market conditions.
You made me think of a conversation that I had with Jeanette Marks, who I know you guys both know, who heads up AirSwift. And I was asking her how they've been able to navigate the industry, really pretty well through this downturn. And she said something that really stood out to me, which is, we really try to be of the industry. And so instead of saying, okay, this is what we provide, who else can we sell it to? She said, we've really taken the approach of, okay, these are our clients. What else do they need? And has really, been more innovative with the product development that they've had in the kind of general employment role. And that's allowed them to roll out some things that have really offset maybe some declines in just temporary help need as a part of that too. So, all right, Danny, we're going to you for the optimism, and your latest data, I think, speaks just to that. So what are you seeing in the CareerBuilder and Monster data?
I'll take it. You can call me Mr. Wonderful. I think we have to go through. So to start, the year has started off on a really strong foot. We've seen about a 20% surge week over week from the close of 2024 into 2025 in the total number of active job postings. And that's even exceeded our forecasts on the growth that we anticipated. And if you shift gears to the year-over-year look, we're up 12% year-over-year. So both week over week and year-over-year, we're showing an increase, which is positive. Now, something else to call out, Monster and CareerBuilder just released what's called our Work Watch report. And we surveyed hundreds of employers. And I'm going to change my name from Mr. Wonderful to the deliverer of good news on this one, but 67% of the employers that were surveyed said that they're going to hire in 2025. That is tremendous, and I guarantee you that number would have been much lower if you asked them that same question on January 16th, 2024.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's music to everyone on this call's ears.
That's great. So we actually have a question. This is great. A good reminder. If you have questions, put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A, and we'll take them kind of as we come across here. I'm going to back up just for a second here. And Noah, this question is for you. Curious if 2024 data does exist for this yet. And then the question that came up was, is other revenue seeming to grow only because the temporary staffing revenue has declined, or is there actual dollar revenue growth there too, not just as the share?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so essentially, this chart is taken through census data, which looks at a breakdown of industry revenue by different revenue streams. And so for the census, the way that they calculate streams of revenue for our industry is temporary staffing services, perm to placement, long-term staffing, and all other revenue. And so, unfortunately, if I was just to take the raw dollar value of revenues for our industry, what we'd see is that temporary staffing services would be one line near the top of the graph. And then most of these other different segments, they would comprise, they would be near the bottom because they as a dollar value, they're much less. However, when looking at the growth rate of those revenues and looking at their contributions to total industry revenue, what we see is that even though temporary staffing services still comprises the vast majority of our industry's revenue, as that is what our industry is founded upon, what we're seeing is that it's comprising much less these days than what it was before. And so that's why it's helpful to look at these different segments in terms of their contributions to total industry revenue rather than just the raw dollar value of their revenue themselves.
Right. And a question about whether this is available as gross margin dollar comparison. I know just enough to be dangerous here to answer that. That's no. They only track the top line revenue on that, correct?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to leave it with you, Noah, and go through kind of what to look at ahead now. And I know you've got a couple slides on this, so I want to spend a little bit of time on what you're seeing here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd actually just like to take a step back and just reference, a point that Danny was making, which is that not only is our industry optimistic, but looking at some of Danny's data, it clearly shows that businesses are also looking forward, looking positive at what this year might bring. However, as I mentioned earlier, there are a couple of wild cards that are on the minds of businesses, and that's really going to affect what happens in terms of both compensation costs as well as labor leverage, and that's TRIPS policy. So that's taxes, trade, regulation, and immigration. So in thinking about how these policies are going to affect the labor market and then compensation and labor leverage, I was able to pull together a couple of data points. The first being tax policy. And so we know that the administration is going to be trying to make permanent the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was first set into law in 2017 with many provisions that were set to expire in 2025. Now, the Tax Foundation did some analyses, and what they are showing is that if these provisions were to sunset in 2025, as the 2017 bill had stipulated, then we might see declining growth in job creation in 2026 and 2027. However, if many of these provisions are made permanent by the new Congress, then we could see a continuing rise in the total number of jobs that are created from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And this would come from the effect of lowering labor costs and elevating labor leverage through the creation of more jobs. There's also the issue of trade. And as many economists have stipulated, tariffs are generally not good for the economy and for the labor market, even though they only protect a subset of industries. And so what we can see is that, China being certainly high on the incoming administration's priorities, if China was to lose its permanent normal trade relations status, in other words, if the administration were to put tariffs onto China, what many economists believe is that these tariffs are primarily going to be affecting goods producing sectors rather than service providing sectors. And so particularly industries like agriculture as well as manufacturing, those are some of the industries that are going to be the hardest hit by these tariffs. And bringing it even one step closer to home, that probably would be a headwind for the light industrial space for staffing. Additionally, one of the other big policies that we're going to be looking at is regulatory policy. And this could be broadly considered a tailwind for the staffing industry due to its impact both on labor costs as well as labor leverage. I'll explain each. So on the left-hand side of the graph, what you see is a comparison between the number of economically significant rules that were eliminated by a presidential administration and the investment that the private sector then embarked upon as a result of having freed up capital. And so what we see is that for the Trump administration, they have been fairly aggressive with cutting back a lot of economically significant rules. And that has also led to some of the highest levels of business investment yet. So due to lower labor costs from less economically significant rules, we can expect that there would be a tailwind to both the labor market, which then results in an increased demand for staffing. Similarly, however, there is also going to be a tailwind in terms of labor leverage by the fact that the federal government is going to probably see some reductions in terms of just raw headcount itself. And so what we can see here on the right-hand side of the graph is that the share of federal employees as a percentage, the share of federal employees relative to all employees within the economy is roughly around levels that we saw back in the 1950s. And so therefore, as the administration continues to lower the amount of employees that are working for the federal government, that's going to mean that there are more employees that are in the labor market, and that's going to mean that there's going to be more churn within the private sector labor market. The last policy that is going to be really crucial for the labor market and in turn staffing employment is going to be immigration policy. Now, of course, this is going to affect sectors differently based on not only the number of undocumented workers that they have within that industry, but also the number of job openings they have at the moment. And so therefore, what you can see is that if the incoming administration were to fulfill many of its promises on the campaign trail with respect to immigration, a sector like agriculture could see almost 1 in 4 employees 1 out of every 4 full-time occupations be unfilled. And so therefore that would leave room for a new worker to come in. For other sectors such as retail, trade, or manufacturing, the potential turnover could be closer to between 5 to 10%. And so therefore, looking at trips, what we see is that all 4 of these policies could either have a positive or negative impact on the costs that employers are facing when it comes to adding headcount, and then employees' ability to move around and successfully land a new job.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. Danny, you're the one that's having the most conversations with staffing firms. What what from the data that Noah has shown kind of stands out or really reinforces the conversations you've been having?
Yeah, that's a good question. Over the last 30 days, I would say the most common thing brought up in my meetings are conversations around the federal space heating up. If I had $1 for every time somebody mentioned the Department of Government Efficiency, I wouldn't be on this call right now and I'd be retired. So, but I think that's very interesting. To echo what Noah said before, the idea that federal workers, the amount is going to decrease, the amount of work is not going to decrease, right? So they're going to have to lean on contractors to fill that gap. With that being said, overall CEO confidence is up across the board. So it's not just in the staffing industry, it's across the space. That's a first. Again, comparing, I don't want to be a dead horse here, but comparing us to Q1 of last year, CEO confidence was not up. So in Q1. So that is definitely going to be more of a tailwind than some of the headwinds that Noah mentioned prior.
So we're going to jump into some of the trends and actually a report that you all sponsored along with ClearEdge and Staffing Referrals. The ClearlyRated 2025 Staffing Buyer Insights report is now available. This is actually kind of a little bit of a sneak peek because our official launch is still coming up on that. But if you use that QR code, you can download that, and we'll make sure to share that with folks as well going into this. So I want to launch one last poll here. The question here is, which of the following trends do you think will have the biggest impact on your business in 2025? The AI tools, increased offshoring and automation, recovery in the broader staffing industry, tight labor market making hiring difficult, or the impact of online platforms such as Upwork and whatnot. So we'll give people just a couple seconds here to be able to kind of go through this. We've got just for my panelists, we've got about 25 minutes left. So we'll kind of go through these trends a little bit quicker just to make sure that we have plenty of time for Q&A at the end there as well. So we'll close out this panel in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we'll share the results here. So broadly across there, a lot of AI. I'm actually interested that AI didn't dominate even further. Danny, what's your take on this? Does this surprise you, this poll?
I think there's a little bit of AI fatigue at this point. So it does not surprise me that that number is under a third.
Yeah. I think the recovery obviously impacts every aspect of our business, and so I think that that's probably a little bit of the selection there as well. So I want to share just a couple of trends. Like I said, we'll go through this pretty quick. I was really influenced this past year by this concept of a day one list, and this is some Google research that they did with general B2B buyers. And what they found is that 81% had what they called a day one list. So a list of at least one or a couple of vendors that they thought could do this potential work for them. And of those that had a day one list, 92% of the time, who they ultimately selected was a vendor from that day one list. And so as part of this research, I said, oh my God, I want to have this for staffing buyers. Let's see if this operates the same. And what we found is that it largely does. Not quite as many had a day one list, 2/3 though, so still well over half. But if they did have a day one list, 93% ultimately bought from the staffing firm that was on their day one list. And so, going back to marketing 101, right, is that sort of awareness and consideration. you have to be a part of that awareness and consideration set. And that to me, really leans into a couple of other things that I want to talk about. The first of which is flexibility. And we're seeing a lot of people getting more creative on how they're filling positions and working side by side with their customers to bring in the flexibility that job candidates still really desire, but to have a little bit more creative look into that. It's not just work from home. It is flexibility on schedules. It's having some available time and PTO. I was just on a customer panel this week where one of the most impactful things they did for retention was that they had rolled out the ability to have a flex day a month. And it was unpaid, but it just gave the flexibility so that their temporary employees could go and see little Susie's dance recital if that was important to them, right? And things along those lines. Really what we're seeing a lot of is focusing on a really deep expertise and a sustainable competitive advantage. I gave that example of really being of the industry. But what the data really kind of leans to is kind of this 3-tiered level. And what buyers are really looking for at that bottom tier is just who could potentially do this work? Who I need to hire, I need this project, I need whatever it is. Now, who could do that work? And that's kind of the first part of this. And so they're looking at, what's your tenure, training credentials, what are the breadth of services on your website? But then that next level is like, okay, they can do this work, but do they understand my space? Do they understand my company and the unique challenges in my industry or my type of business? And that's where they're really starting to look at some of those magnet things that really matter a lot to make that day one list. And then the final piece of that is this evidence of excellence. Okay, so I believe that they have the skills. They know they're experts in their space. Now I believe that they might be experts in my space. And now the last piece of it is like, okay, that expertise only matters in so much as they can actually deliver what I need them to deliver. And that's where we show, things like the star ratings and the reputation components of that as well. And then the last thing I kind of wanted to share on this side of it is, what we're seeing on the statement of work pieces of this. And how the percentage of people that are saying that they're going to additional things that are not necessarily traditional staffing. So increasing overtime, investing in automation. And what you can see down there at the bottom is that the areas that they are saying have increased the most over the last 2 years are areas that are actually competitive threats to the staffing space. So, as I think Noah said earlier, we have to continue to look at how we, continue to evolve our mix of business to really fit on that. And then, Danny, I wanted you to kind of talk a little bit about what you all are seeing, as it pertains to AI, and kind of the gap that you see from, hiring manager to the job candidate.
Yeah, sure thing. On the left-hand side, this chart, you'll see here how employers view artificial intelligence and the impacts that it will have on the recruiting process. So the largest portion of that are optimistic, right? Almost 2/3 of employers are optimistic about implementing AI and making their lives a little bit easier every day. Now, on the right side of the chart, you see how split job seekers are between optimism and ambivalence. And what's important to call out is that there's a huge disconnect between employers being pretty bullish on artificial intelligence and job seekers being pretty meh about AI, right? Historically, job seekers have felt like websites or career portals have been a black hole, right? They already feel like there's a disconnect between them and the hiring process. And the majority of job seekers today feel like AI is going to dehumanize the process even further. So I think it's really important as stewards of the staffing industry and employment in general that we need to help bridge that gap for as many tools that are out there for hiring organizations and staffing firms that use AI. There's equally as many efficiency gain tools for AI for job seekers, right? So we need to make sure that we communicate that to the masses, in tools that help candidates write more appropriate resumes, right? How many times have you applied to a job where you just had one resume and you didn't really feel like customizing it to that job? Now you can open up any of the AI tools out there, plug in the job description and your resume and tell it to customize it and tailor it to that specific job to better your chances of getting a response to a job that maybe you wouldn't have. So it's important that we continue to educate job seekers on how AI can help them and help them feel like it's humanizing the process or increasing their opportunities and chances.
Yeah, I think I come back to this example that I had from quite a few years ago, and I think it was a really good lesson that was learned there. It was a staffing firm that was trying to roll out video interviewing, and it was kind of the early phases of video interviewing, and they were rolling this out, and they were sort of positioning it as, hey, this is way more efficient for you, job candidate. Now you don't have to come into our office and fight traffic both ways. We could do this as a video interview. And they had very few people that were selecting the video interview. Everybody was still coming in and doing the in-person interview. And we worked with them kind of trying to understand why that was. And what we found was like, oh, this light went on when we looked at the data. And they weren't doing it because they felt like they were less likely to get selected for a job if they didn't do an in-person interview. And so they relaunched this, and the positioning now was increase your odds of being hired by doing this video interviewing, because then we can share with the potential hiring managers the video interview as a part of that in a way that we're not able to. So they positioned it as like, this is a tool that helps us do a better job of finding you positions that you're relevant for, and it went through the roof, right? And so we have to make sure that anything that we do around AI, yes, it's nice that it makes it more efficient for them, but Danny, what you're saying is so true. We're going to have a better reception to it if we connect the dots as to why it actually makes it more likely that they're going to find a job that they're excited about, that they're going to find that next step in their career that really matters.
Yeah, many people are so worried about AI displacing people, right? And will it in some situations? Sure, right? But a lot of the intent of AI, and I'm going to quote Todd Balvel from Integrity Staffing Solutions. This resonated with me. He mentioned this to me a year or 2 years ago now. He said, the intent of technology and AI is to turn handwork into hard work. So how do we free up more time for recruiters to talk to more qualified people instead of the mundane and monotonous, paperwork? As a salesperson, right? Am I good at note taking? No, I'm terrible at it, right? Do I update CRMs? No, I'm horrible at that too. So why not outsource that to technology and AI so that I can have more meaningful conversations with my industry partners? And the same thing applies for staffing firms and for candidates, right? So I think it's important to embrace it and make sure that we over communicate the benefits to both sides of this equation, the employers and the candidates.
Yeah, there should be a candidate experience lift in this as well, right? Because exactly what you're saying, it doesn't have the technology. If it's just the technology, does dehumanize the technology with additional time to spend with candidates, to coach candidates, to encourage candidates. That rehumanizes it, right? And that's a gain that we wouldn't get without the technology. So that's a really important piece. Noah, I want to bring you back in now. So we're off the slides. Just talk about what you're seeing now. What is a key strategy from all the data that we've shared, all the trends that we've talked about? What's one of the key strategies that you see in 2025 to help firms accelerate their growth over 2024?
Yeah, Eric. So I worry that if I say AI, I might be unceremoniously kicked off this call. So I'm going to broaden my answer to strategic investments within productivity. And the reason why is because, I was looking at a study not too long ago, and this was done by the McKinsey Global Institute. And what they looked at was the ability for generative AI to be able to be stood up. How long would it take to stand up a generative AI process that would be able to replace different business functions? That included HR functions, that included accounting, that included sales, etc. And out of all of these different business categories, human resources ranked second to the bottom. In other words, what that means is that for a company that wants to invest in getting a tech team together and being able to automate some of its human resources functions, they would be able to automate their human resources functions in a smaller amount of time, in a using a fewer amount of time than other business functions. HR is actually the easiest to do. And so therefore, because companies have that option available to them, it is critical that staffing companies be able to recognize this competition and be able to stay one step ahead of the game. This might not always be AI, but this might definitely be better utilization of technology. And one critical point that Danny made was that, even with this dehumanizing element of AI, that might not resonate that well with the job interviewer. However, where AI does succeed in terms of being able to automate repetitive tasks and being able to make easy hard work, a lot of top of funnel activities from what ASA has been seeing is where staffing companies are really trying to use AI, so that way they can focus more of their time on being able to do second, third, fourth round candidate interactions where AI might not necessarily be as successful or as developed in being able to take over those functions.
Great advice. Danny, what about you? What do you see as the low-hanging fruit for these staffing firms to accelerate growth?
Yeah, I'll say data, and I'll take a step back and say that if 2023 was the year that people were trying to figure out how to spell AI, 2024 was the year that people were trying to figure out how to practically apply that to their systems. And they demoed tools and they implemented some. And towards the tail end of 2024, what we found out, or what our clients found out, was that no matter how amazing a tool is with AI or automation, it's only as good as the data that it sits on top of. And the reality of the fact is that data is changing faster than it ever has before, especially in our recruiting ecosystem. According to the US Postal Service, in the last 4 years, over 100 million people have registered address changes in the US. So people are moving more often than they ever have before, right? They're moving from major cities to the hometowns that they grew up in the middle of America. And if your resume that you have for Jane Doe says they live in New York City, but now they live in North Dakota, you're off on that match.
Yeah.
And then the other piece of data that's changing incredibly fast is the tenure that people spend in a job. And I'll throw myself under the bus and admit that I'm an elder millennial here, and my generation gets a really bad rap for jumping jobs or job hopping. I think my generation coined that term, job hopper, right? So what we're finding is that today, for the first time in history, that 5 generations are in the workforce. And the 4 of them that we've really spent some good time tracking, we found that all 4 of those generations, whether it's Gen Z up to boomers, all of them have a decrease in tenure that they're spending a job. So it's not just millennials that are spending 2 to 3 years at a job, it's everyone. So if you have a profile of somebody that's 2 or 3 years old, chances are they've moved and they've changed jobs. So it's free to practice better hygiene, data hygiene. I know it's not sexy, but it's really important, especially as we rely on AI and other automation tools more in 2025, that we mind our data hygiene. And the first step in that process, I think, is admitting you have a data hygiene challenge. And I'll leave you with this one last statistic, is that Salesforce analyzed over 12 billion records this past year across all of their client CRMs, or many of their client CRMs. And they found that almost 50% of all new records created in their CRM were duplicate pieces of information. So, Salesforce, the most agnostic player in the space, right? They're admitting that most of their clients have a data hygiene issue. So it's really important that you consider that.
That's amazing to me. And we're telling people, when you're looking at the customer journey, you're looking at your talent journey and the talent experience, to really kind of try to change and shift your focus from this idea of people will survey to kind of get feedback, and they kind of use it as a report card. And we've been telling them, no, you need to transition from a report card to a roadmap, right? Where this is giving you the ability to take the information in real time and actually impact assignment, impact retention rates, impact things like that. But what it's really doing now, I think, is actually evolving past a roadmap, which is kind of static, right, to a GPS, which is constantly looking at where you are and where you should be going, and sort of giving you inputs as a part of that. Now, imagine that GPS analogy, as flawed as it potentially is, and imagine if half of the data points are actually incorrect. As a part of that, and how hard that's going to be to actually get to the destination in any kind of predictable, efficient manner as a part of that. It's just really, really difficult to do. And that's, to me, one of the best opportunities here. The other thing that I'll add is sales enablement. I think that this industry needs to really, really think about sales enablement. And, back when I started in this industry, people were like, oh, no, we do a lot of sales enablement. We have stress balls that have our logo on it. We have, coffee cups that have our logo on it. And what I'm really meaning is, if you buy into this day one list, which I really do, then you have to kind of, market as a leader in that space and understanding how you can play in a particular industry. But then you also have to be able to really push your people to be those experts, right? They need to be the extension of that expertise that you as a brand have and bring to that. And one of the ways that we do that is by bringing compelling sales enablement pieces, whether that be reports, research that you have, data that you have as a staffing firm is oftentimes many tens or hundreds of times more impactful than the data that your customers or your prospects actually have. So if you can find a way to weave those stories in, you're really doing a lot to add value and show your expertise in a particular type of job and a particular type of industry there as well. And so I put this report back up. One of the questions in the Q&A was asking if we could have that. Again, that's the QR code there. If you're struggling with the QR codes, then just reach out and we can get you a copy of that. And you can find that as well. So I want to be cognizant of time. We do have just a minute or two to answer a few questions. We've got one in there now. I'll start with that. But for the audience, if you do have additional questions, please go ahead and put them in. We've got just a minute to kind of handle those. This is a question for Danny, and the question is, what are you seeing holding back growth? So we talked about some of the things that we think can lead to growth, but what are some of the things that you see in your conversations that's holding back growth?
Holding back growth. I think that a lot of organizations in 2024 kind of bowed down to the fact that the rest of the industry wasn't doing well, so they weren't going to do well either. Instead of joining, I guess, a pity party, I think in 2025, what we can focus on is kind of, manifesting and creating our own destiny and not relying on how other firms are doing. In the hundreds, if not thousands, of conversations that I've had over the past year, were some staffing firms challenged and stressed in the number of job openings they were working on? Absolutely. But were there other companies that were able to pivot, get into a new industry, and have single-digit, double-digit, triple-digit growth? Yes, 100%.
So I want to finish with this one. It's a question actually for all of us, and it is, as we go through 2025, what are some sources of data that you all look at on a regular basis to give you an idea of where the industry is? Noah, why don't you start with this one, and then Danny, you and I can add to it.
Well, I'd be remiss if I did not mention that ASA has a plethora of real-time data for the staffing industry. We not only have a weekly staffing index that looks at changes in changes within staffing employment, but we also have a quarterly sales and employment survey that not only breaks down different aggregates of employment by sector, but we also take a look at sales. And so we actually have a survey that's going out right now. So if anyone on this call is an ASA member, we would encourage you to take it. But ASA tends to have a really good repository of real-time data that you don't necessarily even get through public data on where our staffing industry is within the current month and or week.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I look at the Fed has what they call their optimism index, And that tends to be really highly correlated, maybe even a little bit of a leading indicator on changes in temporary employment. So as we tend to get more optimistic, we do that. The ASA index is the one that I go to the most because it is the closest to real time, multiple weeks ahead of even the BLS releases. So I go there a lot. SIA has and with Bullhorn, they have their hours index. I think that's a really good real-time indicator as well. And then Danny, what would you add to that?
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say ASA and any other industry association has daily, newsletters, weekly newsletter recaps, and then Bullhorn with their report as well.
Good. So we'll wrap this up. If we didn't get to your question, actually, no, this is a quick one. We have just enough time for this. This just came in. What's your best guess on the impact that TRIPS will have on the industry overall, positive or negative?
I think that there's going to be more tailwinds than headwinds. More of these policies are about lowering labor costs, and that's going to allow businesses to hire more.
Yeah, I think that the tariff piece is a negotiation strategy. I'm hopeful on that because I do think that that's the one thing that could kind of create some mayhem. But separate of that, I see nothing but tailwinds on it as well. So with that, I want to be cognizant of time. Danny, Noah, this has been amazing. As always, I learned so much talking to you all. Everybody that was on the call, thank you. Really appreciate it. And again, we'll be sending out the recording and the slides for you and your teams to review as well. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day and have an amazing 2025. I think it's going to be a good one. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.